So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for day 2 of our Media Development Snapshot speaker series. Today we're having session 3, starting with Dr. Bruce Finley on climate and environment reporting. Bruce Finley covers environment and climate news around Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West in the United States, covering topics from air, land, and water struggles, all these things that shape our future. He's based in Denver as a staff writer for the Denver Post, and he's currently attached to the politics team. Dr. Finley previously covered international affairs and has handled an array of news topics, including immigration issues, growth, and development. He grew up in Colorado, graduated from Stanford University, and then earned a master's degree in international relations as a Fulbright scholar in Britain and in journalism at Northwestern University. His international news work led to on-site reporting in 140 countries with multiple assignments in Africa, Central America, the Middle East, Iraq, and after the 9/11 attacks, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and the Yemen. He has won numerous journalism awards. Dr. Finley is a licensed lawyer interested in human rights and migration. He has also met with a number of journalists who come through Denver on U.S. State Department exchange programs and has spoken warmly of his interactions with journalists from all over the place. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Finley, and thank you all of the participants today for joining us. I'll turn the time over to you. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Okay, well, glad to be with you. I'm here at the foot of the Rocky Mountains in Denver, Colorado, my base for covering environment and climate news. And that's work that I've been doing for about a decade as a reporter for the Denver Post, which is the major news organization serving the people of the region where I grew up. And I'm honored to be included as part of your symposium on environment and journalism. While I have been to about 40 countries on journalism work assignments, I've never been to the South Pacific region. All I know is that it looks beautiful. And so when State Department officials called and Becca told me a bit about your group, I jumped at the opportunity. I see journalism as an enterprise for giving people information they need to make good decisions, even just in day-to-day life. Consider this unopened bottle of Fiji water. It is the first one that I've purchased. And now the question is whether I should drink it. How can I, halfway across the world and not knowing much about Fiji and the South Pacific, make a good, humane decision? On one hand, maybe I'm enticed by the slick marketing and the purity. On the other, a quick Google search of news shows questions raised over how much petroleum and water it takes to produce a bottle of water, the environmental impacts, the fairness for people who might not have access to water as clean as what's being exported. I want to make the right decision, one that's respectful of people and our environment, and I need accurate facts. And so that's the best facts that will come from firsthand reporting by journalists, professionals close to the action, which could give me a base for my own well-informed decision. But now we all face a crucial collective global scale decision-making challenge. It looks as if, from what I make of what a preponderance of scientists are saying, that dealing with climate warming will require the best facts that we can get as this turning up of the thermostat changes the environment everywhere and the impacts intensify. And journalists around the planet are already positioned to be a sort of radar, serving as eyes and ears on what's happening. That radar, delivered to people who respect it and need it, may help us navigate through this challenge, guiding good decisions. The matters could include, what kind of vehicles we produce, how to humanely handle migration, where best to live. all of which may ultimately determine the survival of humanity and other species. So I'm thinking journalism, for those of you who are students, remains a worthwhile endeavor. The same forces that are setting off changes in the South Pacific, such as rising sea levels and extreme storms, are setting off what seem to be a chain reaction of ecological changes here in the Rocky Mountain region of the Western United States. I checked the latest data from the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and confirmed that the global average level of heat-trapping carbon dioxide and methane hit 412 parts per million, which scientists say is higher than it's been in at least 3.6 million years. And back then, 3.6 million years ago, in the mid-Pliocene era, long before humans, sea levels were about 70 feet higher than they are now. Greenland was mostly green, and Antarctica, rather than ice, was islands and had trees. For me, as a news reporter, two things strike me about that latest data that our NOAA scientists have presented. And one is what appears to be a strong consensus now that natural changes cannot explain the warming, and that human activity, the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas, is driving the climate warming. And second, is that despite the pandemic economic slowdown, scientists found that the concentration of the heat-trapping greenhouse gases still increased last year, and that the rate of warming has been increasing over the past 20 years. So what are we in for? Here in the Rocky Mountain West, where I work, the rising temperatures are causing earlier melting of snow on our mountains. And this snow is our slow release water supply. We have aquifers, maybe not as vast and sustainable as the volcanic ones that Fiji water draws from, but we rely heavily on the surface water flows in rivers from snow to sustain a population that's growing. It's more than 40 million people across 7 states, and food growers for much of our nation in the Colorado River Basin. That water comes from snow, and it starts just west of where I live here in the high mountains. And the annual flow in that Colorado River has decreased by more than 10% due to the hotter and drier conditions. And yet people are still moving into the region. The climate warming has led to so many droughts over the past 20 years here that some of our analysts are now starting to say, oh, these are not really droughts, because the word drought implies something finite, temporary, but instead it may be a long-term shift to aridity. The place may be turning into more of a desert. And yet people are migrating into the region. So the rising heat also makes cities less habitable due to a heat island effect, where the pavement over natural surfaces amplifies the heat. That's another topic that we're trying to explore more in my news organization. Dust storms also are on the rise in the southwestern United States. And of course, we're also focusing on bigger, more frequent, and increasingly intense wildfires, burning our forests. Fire played a key ecological role over thousands of years forming the forests, bringing balance and diversity. But the climate warming, combined with decades of suppressing too many fires that thickened the forests and insect infestations, is leading to fires that are burning so severely that many scorched forests may not fully regenerate. And that has global implications, because, as you know, forests around the planet absorb carbon dioxide. Healthy forests in Brazil, Indonesia, and elsewhere may be our best chance for drawing down carbon dioxide in the future. So, as I go about my job, climate warming seems to play more of a role in many stories about the environment, and adds urgency to the stories. And it may affect how we feel about the natural environment. Let me give you a few examples of environment news topics that I've been looking into over the past few years. Uh, Toxic mine spills. For decades, the Western United States has been struggling with this legacy of mining that happened a century ago and left scars and holes in the mountains. And these leak acid water containing sometimes toxic levels of heavy metals, including cadmium, arsenic, lead, and zinc. Laws requiring cleanup have been weak. And a lot of times when a century ago, when the mining was done and wasn't profitable anymore, the miners simply left without cleaning up. And these old mines just degrade the streams and rivers. Remember, this is an arid region, not so lush as your islands. And a few years ago, at one of these defunct mines called the Gold King mine, toxic yellow water that had backed up inside an old mine tunnel blew out, and it surged out of the mountain and into the Animas River, which is a tributary for the Colorado River, and it turned the whole river as yellow as mustard for more than 100 miles. So I'd written about this long neglected environmental problem of toxic mines before, and this time state government officials in Denver told me that they had heard federal government environmental officials had been working at the Gold King mine right before the spill. So I drove through the mountains for about 6 hours, and I went to a place where I could directly observe the impact. This bright yellow water flowing through a city called Durango. And I found a disheveled man outside some government offices, local government offices, and he was going to brief the emergency response supervisors. I introduced myself as a reporter, and the man looked as if he hadn't really slept very well. And then I found out he was the Environmental Protection Agency official who had been trying with his team to move some rocks blocking the opening of the mine when they accidentally triggered this massive spill. And so quickly, before he went into his meeting, as a reporter, I was able to elicit one basic account of the facts. And eventually, public briefings were held. Many other witnesses and sources emerged. The EPA's chief flew out to Colorado. People all over the country were asking questions. When I got back to Denver, I went on some television talk shows trying to help answer some of the questions. In retrospect, it may be that the climate-driven dry conditions are raising concerns about scarce water. And so people in the government are less tolerant of a bright yellow toxic mining spill in the Animas River. Another source of stories for me has been a massive oil refinery run by a Canadian company just north of here in a metro area that has more than 2 million people. And one night, I checked a message on my phone. It was from a fisherman who had learned from a blog post by another fisherman that some sort of thick black liquid was oozing into Sand Creek, which flows around the edge of the refinery. And it's the main waterway. It flows into the South Platte River, and the South Platte River is the main waterway for northeastern Colorado, the source of water for irrigating our food crops. So I tried to verify whether the tip was true. I called the state and county government agencies that are responsible for dealing with toxic spills, asking whether they had any information. And the officials there said no. And I felt a little bit foolish, alarmist. But I also tried the Federal Environmental Protection Agency spill hotline. And I reached a guy there, and he said he hadn't heard anything either, but he did ask me some questions. And I emphasized, I'm just a reporter trying to check out what might be a bad tip. I figured it was nothing, but that evening, just to make sure, I drove around the refinery, and then I hiked to that creek. And sure enough, it turned out that the tip was right. Black goo was oozing up from under the refinery property into the creek and then the river. A company team wearing respirator masks was there, just discovering what was happening. And I noticed that I was getting a headache, probably from inhaling the benzene. And then the next day, the EPA launched a federal cleanup. Contractors used vacuum trucks to try to suck up the oily material and put absorbent booms in place to try to contain the spill, which they did pretty well. And all this led to new scrutiny of water pollution as underground toxic plumes spread from under that refinery property. This refinery also pollutes the air that we breathe in Metro Denver, and it sits in the middle of a low-income neighborhood. A few years ago, I looked at a copy of the operating permit that the state health department issues to the refinery, listing the types of chemicals and gases that the refinery uses and can emit. And I saw a mention of hydrogen sulfide, which is toxic, and I found that there was hydrogen cyanide, more than 7 tons a year. And then later I learned from a congressional staffer that the company was requesting permission to emit more than 12 tons a year of that hydrogen cyanide. So that was a story that we reported. And then I think this oil refinery is another case where concerns about climate warming are changing the context for the story. The refinery processes oil, some of it from around the region, but some of it, the really thick oil sands oil that the company mines from open pits that are carved out of boreal forests in northern Canada. And the refinery produces fuel for vehicles and aircraft and the material used to make asphalt. So many Americans now are calling for a faster shift off fossil fuels because they worsen climate warming to cleaner fuel. And now there's more attention on the refinery. The state health department right now is deciding whether to renew the operating permit. And whistleblowers inside that health department have filed a complaint that the state's permitting process may be flawed, tending to always grant permits for polluters. So I've been trying throughout the reporting on the refinery to hear more from the low-income residents who live right around the refinery. Many of them are Spanish speakers, and traditionally they have not been inclined to speak up at public meetings. I speak basic Spanish, and many have cancers in their family and have respiratory ailments such as asthma, even their children. And they commonly blame the industrial pollution, but they also accept that they probably can't prove direct causation sufficiently to win lawsuits. So these residents increasingly are standing up, and this is forcing government officials to pay more attention and to think carefully about the limits that they could set in those new operating permits, and even eventually, whether they will allow this major oil refinery right at the edge of a big city. The one other example I wanted to mention is the coverage of wildfires. When they burn, the reporting could be relatively straightforward. How many acres burned, how fast are the flames spreading, the number of homes built in burn zones that are destroyed. A more complicated story is emerging now in the efforts to try to prevent fires and whether forests regenerate. More land managers and owners are thinning forests, thinning out the trees in an effort to make the fires less severe when they do burn. After all, some fires natural. And if the trees don't regenerate after the super intense fires, then we lose the capacity for absorbing carbon dioxide, which the US President Joe Biden's administration and senators in Washington are starting to address with greater urgency. So I've been talking with forest scientists who are trying to determine whether the tree thinning makes a difference. And I'm also looking at sort of a somewhat frantic scramble after wildfires to deal with the rising risks of floods and mudslides and sediment slumping into creeks and clogging the water supply systems for cities. About 10 days ago, with a photographer, I hiked with some officials from federal and county government into a burn zone west of our city where helicopters were spreading mulch, and work crews were preparing to install 30 small dams to try to contain soil up on the mountainsides and restabilize the burned slopes. So we face literally cascading impacts from the same climate warming that's leading to the rising sea levels in the South Pacific. Denver and Colorado give me a pretty good vantage point for covering environment news, because many of the global issues around air, land, and water manifest themselves in the Rocky Mountain West. And Metro Denver has federal government-backed science labs where researchers conduct the work on global warming. These include the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration labs, which can draw on sensors which are positioned around the planet, the National Center for Arctic and Alpine Research, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the Energy Department's National Renewable Energy Lab. Inside that one, with a bit of persistence, you can talk to researchers developing cybersecurity systems to try to protect renewable energy power grids, or super sufficient wind turbines and lower cost solar panels. So I am guessing that South Pacific Islands offer an ideal vantage point for telling the story of rising sea levels and how residents respond. Before I turn this over to you, I want to shift and consider a few basic practices and principles that guide what I do in my job. The full true facts around each of those examples that I mentioned would not have been available to the public without reporters who had to push beyond press releases and official spokespeople, statements, public relations, and other forms of information control to get to the bottom of what was happening. I mean, big companies don't typically announce their pollution, and government agencies increasingly orchestrate their presentations and information with a good deal of spin that requires some scrutiny, and gatekeepers sometimes will limit direct access to public officials. So how do reporters deal with that? I mean, after all, our numbers are shrinking at news companies as they cut back. There's no guarantee that robust and free and independent journalism will survive. But what I can say for sure is that many of us still up and running in the United States rely on a similar basic understanding about journalism and some core principles and practices, and fall back on them perhaps now more than ever as our best chance for winning the respect and support of the readers. On the job, I find myself increasingly trying to explain what journalists do to sources, readers, even government agency officials. To survive in hard times, we reporters may have to do a better job of making the case for what we do. So first, where does journalism come from? Human societies always had systems for getting information. Early humans had the capacity to benefit from and seek awareness beyond what their own individual direct experience could reveal, and they probably sent out trusted scouts to see what was happening in the next valley. In ancient times, we know the Romans had accounts of what was said in the Senate posted on papyrus in markets. And we know that in ancient Greece, leaders sent a guy named Thucydides out to find out what was happening in the war between Athens and Sparta. And he described his basic journalistic method for finding the truth. When he asked the warriors on one side what was happening, they spun it their way. And when he asked warriors on the other side, he heard a different account. And then he asked for a third account. And gradually, Thucydides wrote way back then that he managed to get an approximate idea of the truth somewhere in between what those multiple sources were saying. That's still more or less standard practice. The best way I know for a reporter to avoid being played for misinformation or disinformation and to get to the bottom of a matter, I would argue it's still by getting an honest firsthand look at what's happening and by talking with as many different sources as possible, hopefully all on the record. in the United States, the First Amendment of the US Constitution creates a space for free journalism. It enshrines free speech, free assembly, and it says no law can be passed that abridges the freedom of the press. So why did the founders of the US prioritize having freedom of the press? That answer probably lies in the struggle to win independence from our colonial masters in Britain. I've heard it argued that the American revolutionary forces were able to prevail against the superior British military forces, in part because they had a good system for gathering and relaying correct information on time. Before independence, the emerging free press wasn't allowed to criticize British ruling authorities. But around 1734, a publisher named Peter Zenger dared to print an article in a New York newspaper that alleged the royal governor was corrupt and he had allowed some French boats in the harbor and other misdeeds. And Zenger was arrested by the British authorities for libel, but a jury acquitted him. And the lawyer for Zenger argued that because those allegations were true, the article that was true, Zenger could not be guilty of libel. And so this little court case established truth as a defense against libel, a key legal precedent for freedom of the press, which later, with independence, gained protection in that very First Amendment of the Constitution, and creates the space we can operate in today. The basic idea back then was that democracy would die in darkness, and founders of the United States helped give independent journalism a place as a fourth estate, independent, along with the three branches of the government. So let's skip ahead 250 years where we're operating now, in the era of smartphones and selfies, which have instilled this wide expectation among our readers and people we serve and work with of being able to control what other people see. And powerful and wealthy people in particular have the ability to try to control news and present imagery and put out the informational equivalent of selfies. So we face a lot of confusion about the definition of journalism. If we all right now jotted down in one sentence the purpose of journalism, would we have the same definition? The one I use was articulated by a group called Committee of Concerned Journalists. And that's one that many professionals in the United States use and that I'll sometimes tell sources. The purpose of journalism is to provide citizens with the information they need to make the best possible decisions about their lives, their communities, their societies, and their governments. I remind sources of this now and then. I also emphasize in this time when the difference between propaganda and journalism is often blurred, that the journalism we rely on as our information system runs according to a few key principles. It's surprising how often these days the people we serve need reminding. I'll say, the first obligation of journalism is to provide true information for the people we serve, conveyed fairly in context, ideally with some humility that acknowledges that there may have to be more investigation. Then who do journalists work for? I say, well, the first loyalty of journalists is to the readers we serve, not the sources of the information, not the government, not to the owners of our company. So being clear that reporters are here to serve as the eyes and ears for people in a democracy helps us set priorities and determine what matters and what doesn't. The essence of journalism is a discipline of verification, a consistent method of gathering and then testing information, and a transparent approach to the evidence. So this independent verification is to make sure the news is accurate. The method is objective, not necessarily the journalist. A scientist has an objective method for finding out the truth by experimentation and testing and carefully assessing the results. Same for journalism. And the main elements, are, seeking out multiple witnesses, disclosing as much as possible about the sources, asking all sides for comment. I tell sources and readers that this method of discipline for verification is what separates journalism apart from all the other information that you can receive on the internet, such as propaganda, advertising, and entertainment. And finally, I find myself also reminding sources that reporters have to maintain an independence from those they cover. It's a cornerstone of our reliability. It means not becoming seduced by the sources, intimidated by power, compromised by self-interest. I pay for my own cup of coffee in a meeting with sources. I don't accept gifts. I try to stay open-minded and curious throughout the reporting because I want to be able to see beyond commonly held assumptions. So these foundations are probably quite familiar to you. In conclusion, I can say the principles seem to work pretty well in the complex and busy, politically charged, and increasingly interesting task of covering the environment as climate warming intensifies. Dealing with the impacts may be the challenge of our lives. I'm interested to hear from you. What evidence have you seen that climate changes are becoming a bigger factor and compelling people to move? We will need better radar, including news from the South Pacific, where governments may become the leaders in global efforts to deal with climate warming. And it will broaden our understanding and give a basis for smart global scale action to navigate humanely. I would be glad to and do my best to address any questions that you have. Please be open and direct. I am just one reporter. I expect you will question and wrestle with everything I've said. That's the nature of our enterprise.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Finley, for all of that. That was really helpful. I know that climate is definitely a big topic that all these journalists look at on a regular basis. But then, you ended with a lot of other really important topics about just journalism, freedom, and the rights and responsibilities of journalists. So thank you for that. I'm going to open it up to questions. So please, you're welcome to raise your hand. You can just, jump in there. Let's hear your questions. You can also write them in the chat if you're not interested in being on camera.
Dr. Finley, thank you for that. Can I ask, with regards to climate and environment reporting, what would you say, given an overload of information that we have, and how news is 24/7 these days, what would, if someone is covering a climate or environment story, what do you think are elements that would make that story stand out?
I guess it depends on the story. That's the question that we all ask every day. But if it directly affects people and it has details in it, I think those are visceral elements of any story that would interest people. Does that help?
Yes.
I mean, if I already suggested, I'm still kind of wondering what's the right thing to do about Fiji water. There's a detail, and it's something in day-to-day life. And wow, it would sure be interesting to know more about where that comes from. That would be a specific thing that could be very engaging. Now, getting more directly into climate impacts, we all know of the South Pacific, but it's very hard to be there. But you journalists are in that region, and we're landlocked here. I don't really know how to read ocean swells, but if swells were getting bigger or more frequent, that's a lot more interesting nowadays than just the traditional weather report. And I should think Frontlines details of what it's like if you work or live near the big swells, or what the grandparents tell the children, maybe the story of somebody's effort to move higher up the mountain, would all be stories that would be extremely engaging, probably for anyone in the world who cares about how people are navigating these changes.
Rosie, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, please. Rosie, we're not hearing you. Maybe you want to put your question in the chat. Oh, okay, here we go. Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Rosie. I work for Refugee Sun. Thank you so much for all that you've shared this morning. Last year we started a climate watch column, which we run every week. That stemmed out of a workshop that we did with Internews. And we've been doing that consistently over the past few months. Out of that, a lot of stories, many wide-ranging stories, all related to climate change. From human rights being affected, relocation programs, one that we're doing at the moment, and many others. My question is to do with, how can a journalist, when they're covering a story and it's to do with a company which supports the business, and there's pressure not to cover. What would be your advice?
Well, I think as those situations come up, the best position for a reporter I found is to fall back on the fundamentals of journalism. The answer to a lot of the challenges journalism faces, I think, lies in simply doing journalism, independently and fairly. Feels like the most solid way to navigate pressures, and perhaps a bit of that explanation I was suggesting at the end. In most democracies, there's some sort of space allowing for operation of free press, and a bit of reminder, perhaps. A very professional approach to the company officials involved, perhaps. The business card, identifying yourself as a reporter, explaining a bit why you're there, and your duty as a journalist serving the people the journalists serve in a democracy to gather the information, and how you very much want to hear their side of things and their details that could enrich the story, because you all have a shared interest in accuracy. And sometimes I think dealing with powerful interests by just showing your professionalism is a good way to win respect. And I don't know the full situation of how you're working in the South Pacific and the constraints, but having worked a good bit in other parts of the world, including countries that are authoritarian, I found even in a place like Syria, right before the war, U.S. invasion of Iraq, that there is real understanding in the culture for the role of a scribe. I had the disadvantage of not speaking Arabic working around the Middle East, but I learned that word sahafi, and I found even in Iraq, when it was still under Saddam Hussein, I could go into, say, a Shia mosque and tell the imam I'm sahafi, and they instantly understood, yeah, this guy's the scribe, he's going to write something and he needs to hear from everybody or it won't be very well informed. And so maybe this is a way that we can begin to creep, even when there are constraints, close to those who might intimidate us, and appeal to the higher angels. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, very, very useful. Thank you. Thanks.
All right, thanks. We've got some questions that have come in the chat. So one from Bula from USP, and thank you, Dr. Finley, for the interesting points and observations you raised. You mentioned that one way to avoid misinformation is to get to the bottom of the matter. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this? What are some tips you use and some examples?
Well, boy, that's a daily struggle. And by the way, I've never been called doctor before. I mean, I'm just a reporter, so this is quite flattering. My children will laugh. Um, I think just by being persistent about that, needing to get to the bottom of things. I'm a reporter, and it's my job. I got to get to the bottom of this thing. And if they send you an official statement which is unintelligible, I'm several times a week going back and saying, if I put that in my report, it wouldn't serve readers very well. It doesn't serve your agency very well, because can you understand it? And sometimes I'll just read back the statement and I'll say, I'm going to have to paraphrase it, because if I put it in my story, the editor that I work with as my colleague will reject that part of the story. They'll say, what does that mean? And they're liable to tell me to just leave it out. And I really want the voice in there. So to get to the bottom of this thing, I need you to put the official on the phone. That's my first request. And if you don't put the official on the phone, I need to be transparent by my principles. So I'll say, agency officials, declined to discuss the matter directly. Instead, they issued a statement. And then if that statement is garbled and wordy and looks like it was written by a committee, you can explain politely to that agency, I'm going to have to paraphrase this. I think it means this. Is that correct? And if not, could you give me maybe send me another statement that's a little more clear? Or better yet, just grant our request to talk to the official who's the expert here, because we want to give good information to people. Does that help you? Getting to the bottom of things sometimes requires going back and back. Now, if you have interested and willing sources who talk your ear off, and there are a lot of complex facts, I think in that situation, getting to the bottom sometimes requires careful questioning. Take them around the block one way, and then maybe take them back around the block another way and see if it all changes, stays the same, until you get comfortable with it. Just like you do if you're out on the street as a police officer trying to find out what happened. It takes a bit of talking to the multiple sources and those other things I mentioned in the talk. Does that help you on the matter of getting to the bottom of things?
It just came in chat, so hopefully, yes.
Oh, cool.
Question that came in chat. I think it touches on this a little bit, but maybe you could expand on it a little bit more. This is from USP. Oh, and Rosie said it was useful. So, so Geraldine from the USP Journalism Program says, how do you go about breaking down scientific jargon? And when you get these big reports that are very scientific in nature, how do you explain that in a way that makes sense to the readers, to the audience? And getting into the different, what it means for everyday living, what it means for the environment.
Yeah, boy, that's a hard one. I read the abstracts and I think I understand them, and I'm not trained as a scientist. I'm fascinated by science. I usually want the scientist on the phone. So when the agencies send you those new publications, first of all, I don't like the press release, because that means there's a third party in there interpreting it. So the first thing I do is I get rid of that. I call the number on the press release and say, hey, I'm interested in that report you mentioned. Can I have the actual report? And then I say also put the name of that scientist on there so I can converse with them. With complicated things, I want a back and forth conversation, because I want to make sure I'm interpreting the jargon correctly. And when scientists say, well, you're just dumbing it down too much, I'll say, well, let's pretend we're having a beer or a coffee, and you explain it to me as if you were explaining it to your partner, to your children. You don't need to dumb it down, but I need to be able to understand it in conversational language. Perhaps if a scientist still stays in the jargon, you can say, if you were asked to come in and brief the governor or the president on your important findings, I'm sure you'd want to convey the full import. How would you talk to them? So I'll use tricks like that to try to relax the scientists and bring them back into plain speak. It definitely a really big challenge, because to me, science has never been more important. And a lot of scientists, for a lot of different reasons, just don't want to come out of the focused world of science into the real world of where the science is going to play its role.
Thank you very much. We have one question from Anna from the French Embassy, and then we'll go over to Shailendra, who's also at USP. So Anna says, what are some of the main challenges you face when trying to cover an environmental story? What are the general pitfalls?
I think that last question was a good one. Taking arcane and voluminous and technical material and finding out what matters. I'm thinking about most of the readers and what they need to know, and then communicating that clearly without dumbing it down. I think that's a huge challenge. There are other challenges I kind of like. I mean, I mentioned a couple times getting direct firsthand look at things, and that can lead to some adventures over the years. I like to be out in boots, hiking, paddling down rivers. I really think it helps as a journalist. It's efficient in the long run, even if you have to drive 6 hours to go to where the toxic spill is happening and look at it. That's part of your duty of going to the back of the cave and finding out what's happening and then coming back out and telling everybody else. So that can be a challenge. Bad weather, driving in the middle of the night, long hours, etc. There's sometimes a hazardous environment on this planet that you work in, and good news companies offer training for operating in hazardous environments, and I think that there can be huge challenges there, not just for environment and climate journalism, but for lots of coverage. Other challenges, I have a sense that language skills are really going to be useful down the road. Climate impacts playing out around the world, migration flows are going to mean if you've got linguistic skills, more than one language, it's going to really be an asset.
Thank you so much. We're going to go over to Shailendra Singh. So if you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, now thank you for a really interesting and informative presentation. Can you hear me clearly?
I can, and my pleasure.
Okay. Sorry, my camera switched off because of connectivity reasons. But it's really useful to have to listen to experiences and also perspectives from another country. We rarely hear something from a country like the United States, so it's really useful to draw examples and to draw comparisons with what's happening in Fiji and the region. Now, my question is, when you look at climate change coverage in our part of the world, sometimes there's really no direct link to a situation that might be happening with climate change. And then what I've observed is the stories and the reporters maybe are too quick to make a connection with climate change without sufficient evidence. For example, there might be no local research linking climate change to a situation. All you have is, testimonies and interviews and experiences maybe of the local people who live there, but no scientific evidence. And when you read the story, sometimes, people here, they don't really complain, but at least for some readers, I would think that the story might appear shaky and unconvincing. So when there's no research, when there's no scientific evidence, how do you best attribute a situation to climate change and make the story more believable and convincing?
Yeah, I really agree with what you said here. That's great guidance and a reminder that we reporters have got to be pretty humble and cautious in doing the stories around climate and environment. There's huge uncertainty. And I think sometimes just in the wording, we can be careful. And that's hard to do as the news world speeds up and the digital producers want to push out content fast and summarize in bit.ly bytes for the social media, the main findings of a report. There's always going to be this sloppiness about, if I've got your point right, that it's stating direct causation, when from a scientific point of view, it may not be direct causation. I find myself in an awful lot of climate stories wanting to inject climate into the story, but in a sort of background way. I use words like linked by scientists or linked by a preponderance of scientists to climate change, rather than a word like, caused by or due to. And these are things that a reporter kind of has to bring up and maybe take a difficult stand on regularly with editors. They'll say, well, you've been seduced by the scientists. You're too far into the weeds of this thing. Let's just say it's due to climate change. And I'm saying, I'm really not comfortable as a journalist saying due to. It's linked by scientists to climate, or climate changes are leading to conditions that favor this sort of event. But we can't really say that this specific fire or this specific storm was directly caused by turning up the temperature around the planet. It's just that turning up the temperature is changing the conditions in a way that's setting off changes. And I really like the way you articulated the challenge there. And I hope that answers your question a little bit about, I think that's where the principle of humility is essential for trying to be a reporter on this kind of a topic.
Yep, thank you. That was helpful. And what we can also do maybe is sometimes there are reports available. Based on those reports, you can draw some kind of link. I mean, there are sometimes comments made by experts. You can link it to a local situation without sort of, directly attributing it. I mean, it is at least some sort of evidence. What I find is mostly climate change reporting, you carry a lot of hearsay, maybe. People might see it as hearsay. And this is not just the ordinary people you interview. If you read some of the speeches sometimes made by politicians, the evidence is lacking. But you can draw indirect connections, of course, by some of the reports that are available, international reports and some regional reports. But thank you. That was a really useful answer for our students.
Yeah, thanks for a great comment and question.
So while we wait for some other questions to come in, I'm going to ask one that have been traveling around the embassy for a little while. The leaders in a lot of the countries in the Pacific are real climate leaders, and they make lots of bold statements. They're really forward-leaning on climate. What is some of the ways that you can kind of bring the public along? Because some people in the public are absolutely convinced and they're on board, but others need a little more convincing that this means that it's less convenient. Certain things are less convenient in terms of lifestyle changes. So can you maybe talk a little bit about reporting to an audience that might be a little more reluctant?
I'm trying to make sure I understand exactly what the question is. Is it an audience that's a climate skeptic audience where they've been swayed by internet sources that say, climate change isn't real, or maybe they're just scientists, contrarians who believe most of the changes are within natural variation? Or,
I don't know that there are a lot of climate deniers in the Pacific but I think there are certainly people that the changes needed to address climate change, to meet targets, to stop global warming are inconvenient. And so, or tying like this activity that you do every day to climate change, that kind of reporting. So it's not that they're deniers per se, but not knowing that I have to actually take steps.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in hearing from and talking with the leaders, political leaders, who are taking on this challenge. I mean, a great leader will be able to inspire people to tackle huge challenges. How could we all get out of, where I'm at, vehicle pollution is, if you wanted to do one single action as an individual that would sort of align you with a positive course of action, it would probably be to get out of your gas burning vehicle into an electric vehicle. But the new models really aren't there yet. Some of them cost up to $80,000. And so an awful lot of people would like to tackle the challenges, but just can't. And perhaps the leaders who will be most effective are the ones who can incentivize and persuade and make it possible for people to do the right thing collectively. I mean, that is, to me, that's, I guess, getting into the realm of solutions reporting, as they call it. And I recently tried to take a look, sort of a consumer-facing look at the electric vehicle situation, which is really complex. And that was interesting. I went out to car lots and, checked out prices of cars and consumer behavior on the lots. And really, we don't have very many vehicles on our roads yet that are electric vehicles. And, we're hearing leaders trying to persuade people to do that, but they haven't really delivered the incentives yet. So for the average working person moving, well, there is some migration going on. I'm curious about that. I mean, there are people in the southeastern United States who've been hit by so many extreme storms that they seem to be looking for safer places to live. It's a fascinating topic, and I haven't heard a lot of leaders addressing that. Certainly, any leader in the South Pacific, they're going to have instant clout around the world, because we're better to tell the story of the impacts of climate change and how they affect people. And I personally think island nations will have a huge voice in the planet, and the whole planet's going to need to hear that story.
Thank you very much. Fortunately, the Pacific has been, very vocal in these international fora, and they're definitely raising the alarm bells. So that's been very helpful for the climate on the front of climate reporting. So thank you. We have any other questions that anyone would like to put in the chat or raise your hand? Right. So if not, can you just give us some parting words of why climate reporting is important these days?
Well, I'm not going to drink from my bottle of Fiji water yet until I get some more facts. I don't want to. I want to make a good decision, and it's a pleasure to participate. And I'd be interested to hear more from the region. And thank you for including me.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone thanks everyone so much for participating, and thanks for joining in for this professional development series. Have a wonderful day, everyone. And you're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. So
yeah, thanks.
Vinakavaka levu, as we say out here.
Oh, that's cool.
Have a lovely day, everyone.
Okay, bye.